Hello, this is Pamela Smythe, Media Relations Manager at the University of Waterloo. I'm one of the hosts of Beyond the Bulletin, the podcast of internal communications at the university. We bring you news and views from the U Waterloo community. Please spread the word that we're on SoundCloud.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And now the interview from episode 93 of Beyond the Bulletin. The Glow Centre for Sexual and Gender Diversity is the oldest continually running university-based 2S LGBTQ+ group in Canada. Entirely volunteer-run, Glow promotes a healthy attitude towards all sexual orientations and gender identities at Waterloo. And this year it turned 50. Jeremy Steffler is a staff member in cooperative education and the chair of the board for the Waterloo Region Rainbow Coalition. He was a member of Glow when he was a student at Waterloo and shares the contributions it has made to the lives of people on campus these many decades. Jeremy, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for inviting me, Pamela. I'm so happy to be here.
So when were you a member of Glow?
Well, I started attending the discussion groups run by Glow, or what's now known as the Glow Centre, around 1998 and became more involved as a volunteer within about a year after that, and stayed involved in a lot of their peer support roles until 2012 and more as an advisor up until about 2014 and off and on a little bit since then.
Why were you so involved?
Well, Glow was a place that I could rely on for support initially, and then it became a place of community for me. Almost like a second family. And I think just as there were individuals that created that safe, supportive space for me to sort things out myself when it was a difficult time for me to do so, I wanted to provide that same environment for others. And so I think that was a driving motivation for getting involved with Glow.
What role has the Glow Centre historically served on campus? Because 50 years, that's a long history.
Yeah, and certainly the Glow Centre has had many names and many structures over that period of time as well. But I think what's been relatively constant is that provision of community for individuals with diverse sexual and orientations and gender identities, and also support and advocacy for those individuals to be their authentic selves on campus and in the wider community. I think that historically, the Glow Centre has also served as a valuable connection between our campus and the wider community. The Glow Centre was founded as almost a campus community partnership, and I think this set the foundation for much of the Glow Centre's work, at least for the period of time that I was involved with the organization.
So it started as a student club, though, right?
When it first became recognized by what is now known as WUSA, and you'll probably hear that a lot because so many of the names of all the organizations have changed over 50 years. The first official recognition was as a club, yes.
Glow used to be an acronym, and now it's not. Can you explain that to me?
Glow used to be many acronyms. When Glow was first founded, it was known as WUGLM, actually, the Waterloo University's Gay Liberation Movement. After a number of years, I don't know exactly when the first name change happened. I imagine when it became a club, actually, it became known as Glow, with one L, which was the Gay Liberation of Waterloo. And then it became Glow with two L's, the Gay and Lesbian Liberation of Waterloo. And then it morphed into Gays and Lesbians of Waterloo for a long period of time. But more recently, and when I say recently, that's, from my perspective, the past 10, 15 years or so, it was acknowledged that using or referring to just gay and lesbian was not really representative of the broader 2S LGBTQ plus community or rainbow community or other terms that are used. And the Glow Centre had a lot of branding and investment in being known as Glow. So decided to retain Glow just as the word and is now known as the Glow Centre for Sexual and Gender Diversity to reflect that broader range in the community and not to exclude those by virtue of a name of acronyms.
Right. So to be more inclusive.
Exactly.
Why was it created?
In some respects, the same need for a community and support that we see today existed 50 years ago. And that was one of the drivers. But there was also a much stronger focus on advocacy and fighting for basic human rights. The fact that the name included gay liberation which was the term that was used at the time to advance rights and to protest for rights, was pretty common, and that it's not a coincidence that it was incorporated into the name of Woglum at the time. But it was also a very different time. Being a member of GLOW at that time and being out and public as someone who identified as gay or lesbian at the time was not without risk. Early members were subject to much public scrutiny. There were threats of violence that still exists today, but much greater risks at the time. And there was even records that the RCMP were keeping tabs on the activities of what is now the GLOW Center members at the time.
Really?
From a public safety. Yes. So it was a very different time, but there were concerns at the time that individuals who identified with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities were at risk of blackmail. And so the RCMP were trying to ensure that individuals didn't enter the public service or in areas of potential high security risk. And so they were keeping tabs on student groups and organizations throughout the country to block or prevent individuals from getting positions in certain public services. And that's one of the things that I believe the current government has been acknowledging and looking to provide apologies for as well.
Oh boy, we'll have to watch for that. So you are the chair of the board of the Waterloo Region Rainbow Coalition. What can you tell me about the effect that, or the impact that GLOW has had on the broader community? So beyond Ring Road and our campuses.
There's a lot of impact. For the first 40 years or so, the GLOW Center was a really unique identity in that it was officially recognized by what is now known as WUSA as a club or a service, depending on what time frame we're looking at, but it was also actively supported by the local community. So alumni and community members volunteered alongside students. They donated money to add books to the library, buy furniture for the office, pay for office moves, lots of things. The discussion groups, peer support lines, and other events were open to all. So the GLOW Center very much helped set the foundation for the entire support system for the rainbow community in Waterloo Region. And if I were to, just reflect on who the founders of other local community organizations have been, those organizations that support diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, there are often a lot of connections to the GLOW Center, not exclusively, of course, but there are a lot of connections. What is now known as Spectrum, which is a local community center, started as a initiative actually of the Waterloo Region Rainbow Coalition that was really led by myself and Jim Parrott, who was one of the founding members of GLOW. Jim and a working group once the community center was formed, and they spun off from the Waterloo Region Rainbow Coalition and formed Spectrum, which have been doing amazing work in the community. So you can't underestimate the impact that the GLOW Center has had on Waterloo Region.
What are some of GLOW's priorities now?
Well, I recently had a chance to connect with the current coordinators of the GLOW Center, Midas and Sarah, just to get some information on what their answer to that question might be. And of course, they are a student service. So as you mentioned, the current focus is on the undergraduate student population at the University of Waterloo. And like many 2S LGBTQ plus organizations, a lot of their current efforts are focused on continuing to ensure that they're providing a safe and inclusive space for all members of that community. And so this includes working to repair systems that have allowed racialized students to maybe feel excluded and uncomfortable in the GLOW community in the past. Certainly that's a topic of conversation for the entire campus community. And they're looking to acknowledge and apologize for past mistakes and find ways of prioritizing a focus on racialized students moving forward. They're also looking to be more inclusive and provide more visibility to the Two-Spirit community who have historically been erased in conversations related to sexual orientation and gender identity. The acronym, which has changed a lot over the years, and I'd say over the past number of years has shifted to be 2S LGBTQ+, and that's to provide greater acknowledgement of Two-Spirit identities. And they just completed a social media campaign to highlight Two-Spirit Awareness Day, which was June 17th, and to highlight resources and accounts and people who identify as Two-Spirit. Other things that the GLOW Center has been doing is I've seen them do some excellent advocacy work in connecting students with course instructors and departments to look at some course materials to make sure that they reflect current research and understanding of sexual orientation and gender identity, which is really important work in our campus community.
Yeah. Wow. They're still serving such an important role on campus, even 50 years in.
Absolutely.
So on the acronyms, I'm wondering if you could help with some understanding here. So you're right, it has changed a lot. I'm not aware of all of the various versions of it, but I mean LGBTQ, LGBTQ plus, then the 2S LGBTQ plus. I have also seen online LGBTQQ IP2SAA. I that didn't catch on, surprisingly. You don't think? What should we be using? Please enlighten me.
Well, it's first. I think it's important to keep in mind the historical context that a lot of the early terminology used gay. There was a reason why Wuglum was gay liberation, etc. If we kind of think back to the 60s and 70s, it was illegal to identify. People could be jailed. The World Health Organization listed homosexuality as a mental illness for a number of years, even beyond the 70s. So the ability for the community itself to get together and discuss and wrap its own collective mind around what is this sexual orientation thing? What is this gender identity thing? How do members of the community interact with each other? What supports do they need? There was this growing understanding. And over time, there, as you can imagine, people started realizing, oh, well, we have things in common, but there's also differences. And as there's been more acceptance and more understanding and more conversation and more people are comfortable being identifiable as members of the 2S LGBTQ plus community, that the term we use now, we've seen more of these acronyms kind of form because we want to provide visibility to all the diversity that exists within the community. So even the GLOW Center, the reason why it changed from being an acronym to the GLOW Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity, using an acronym can exclude people. And so there have been also terms such as the queer community or the rainbow community that have tried to provide a greater umbrella. But those terms are sometimes problematic because they also don't show the diversity that exists within the community. So more recently, we have seen the 2S LGBTQ plus for a few reasons. The plus to kind of identify that 2S LGBTQ does not encompass all members of the community in that acronym and acknowledging the limitations of the acronym. And the shift to 2S as being at the beginning of the acronym really is a sign of solidarity with Indigenous communities. As Indigenous people were here first, they should be placed first in the acronym.
Well, it's Pride Month. It wasn't always a month. People maybe don't realize, and people maybe don't realize that there wasn't always a Pride parade too. What is the significance of Pride Month?
From my perspective, I always remember that Pride started as a protest. The first Pride events were really a fight against systemic discrimination and a fight for basic human rights. And over the years, Pride has also taken on a little bit of a celebratory nature, celebrating what has been accomplished over the years. However, not all groups within the 2S LGBTQ plus community have gained rights or are seen advancements at the same rate. So, for example, human rights protections based on sexual orientation were provided 20 years before the same rights were extended to gender identity and expression. And yet all those individuals were present for the first Pride marches and the first protests. So there's always been this tension between Pride as a celebration and Pride as a protest. And both of those lenses kind of come into play at Pride Month.
Well, there are a couple of big news events that are happening during Pride Month. Carl Nasib, he's the defensive end for the Las Vegas Raiders. He came out as gay in a video online. I saw it on Twitter. He's the first active NFL player to come out. I may be leading the witness here, but how seismic is this?
It's incredibly, incredibly important. We have images in our minds as to what it means to be someone who is two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, asexual, aromantic, all the different letters in the acronym. Individuals within the community don't see themselves represented in a lot of popular sports. And so to have an athlete come out and provide visibility is incredibly important. And let's hope that this is a moment that is going to lead to some of the changes in breaking down of the systemic barriers that we see in sports today.
Now, also in the news, the House of Commons is pausing for summer vacation this week. As we record this, there is still a little bit of time left for the government to get its priority bills into law before the break and possibly a fall election, if there's one that's called. One of them is Bill C6, which is the conversion therapy bill. Conversion therapy, for those who don't know, it's aimed at changing a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. It's highly controversial. And this bill creates 5 new criminal code offenses so that it would be illegal to cause a person to undergo conversion therapy against their will, causing a child to undergo conversion therapy, and profiting from providing conversion therapy. What are your thoughts?
This is something that's needed to happen for quite some time. There have been so much harm done trying to change individuals to be somebody they aren't, and to have that forced upon them. The reason people still need to come out is a default assumption of what an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity is. And at all age ranges, I believe the rates of suicide are still much higher within the 2S LGBTQ plus community than they are for other demographics. And conversion therapy, focusing on changing somebody to be somebody that is more societally acceptable, and I'm using those terms with air quotations in my mind, is just reinforcing that there's something wrong with identities that there's absolutely nothing wrong with.
Right.
And forcing somebody to go through that against their will. It's really difficult for me to talk about, frankly, because over my years in working in the community and with GLOW, there are individuals that I have lost due to suicide.
I'm sorry.
Because of I won't say conversion therapy, but because of this stigma.
Right.
And there have been individuals that I know have lost friends and that kind of second family because they felt they had to go through conversion therapy in order to be accepted by their family, their culture, or their faith, or other groups. And so there's still a lot of work to be done, but certainly taking away, forcing people to go through therapy against their will is a really, really necessary step.
Well, in addition to your work in the community, you are also the faculty relations manager in cooperative education. And the first time you and I spoke actually was when we unveiled our inclusive washrooms.
Yes, that's correct.
So how's that going? Can you give us an update?
Well, I think as with many things that just seem to make sense, and once they're implemented, there's not a lot of conversation about them because, of course, we should have had them all along, and they're not really newsworthy. I think there are still a number of areas of campus that we still, at the Waterloo campus, that still need to have some work done. We have some older buildings. We have other buildings on our campus that might not have been built with those washrooms in play. So there's still some work to be done to add more inclusive washrooms on campus. But I think there's broad buy-in and understanding of why those spaces are needed. And to be clear, the way we've implemented them at Waterloo is very much with an intersectional lens. So yes, there's support for gender identity and gender expression that's tied to inclusive washrooms, but we also wanted to make sure that individuals with certain health needs, families that have unique needs for those facilities were also able to benefit from the implementation of those washrooms. So I think that intersectional lens on a lot of the equity work we do is so important, and the inclusive washrooms were a great example of that.
It wasn't that long ago, but it was still a news story when it happened.
Absolutely. It amazes me, even looking at the past number of years we got the inclusive washrooms, but I was surprised initially that it was only, I think, 2016, within the past 5 years, that the Pride flag was first flown on Parliament Hill. It is actually amazing how many things that I just thought, that's been happening for a while. And I was like, actually, no, that's only been the past few years that these things have been happening. So you're right, it was newsworthy at the time, but it's amazing how quickly, it's once people kind of get through the initial, it's like, oh yeah, we probably should have had that all along, and we move on. And so it's not really that scary once we do it, right?
Right, exactly. Well, what other equity projects, related projects, are coming up? Anything?
Well, there's, I think, a number of initiatives underway at Waterloo. Of course, we know about the work of PART and the recent equity data survey that's been released. And I think all this work really amplifies our collective awareness of equity and systemic barriers at Waterloo, which hopefully also will support all equity deserving groups, including those with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. So there's, of course, that overriding work we're doing at our institution. I know specifically the GLOW Center has been looking at organizing some HIV 101 sessions and looking at getting post-exposure prophylactics added to the student care plan, since it's not currently available for Waterloo students without getting special permission. There's been a group since about 2000 that was most recently a working group of the Provost Advisory Committee on Equity, which was known as the Sexual and Gender Diversity Working Group. And they've recently formed an alliance, they're now called the Gender and Sexual Diversity Alliance, of faculty, staff, and students that are working at looking at the intersections between equity deserving groups. So not just looking at sexual orientation and gender identity in isolation, but also as it intersects with race, disability, religion, and culture. Oh. They're also taking ownership of the Making Spaces program, which has been on a bit of a hiatus since the pandemic started, but will hopefully be up and running once we're able to meet in person again. The Making Spaces program was organized a few years ago to really create a community of practice or help provide education and training to individuals that wanted to take on more of an allyship role to support individuals of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. So, in the course of their jobs, in the course of their day-to-day work, could see where there might be changes that could be made to be more inclusive, to be listed on a website so faculty, staff, and students knew who they could reach out to for support or referral.
Well, what other points would you like to make before we say goodbye today?
Well, I think, keeping in mind that 50th, anniversary of GLOW, I think in the spirit of Pride, it's important to celebrate what the GLOW Center has accomplished over the past 50 years. First in starting as a community organization and then becoming a student organization. It really does speak to the power of community to work together to support one another.
Tremendous impact over 50 years. Thank you so much for being here, Jeremy. I really appreciate your time and your insight.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this interview from the Beyond the Bulletin podcast from the University of Waterloo. To listen to all of episode 93 or indeed any others, look for Beyond the Bulletin podcast on SoundCloud.com. Please join Brandon, Sweet, and me for new episodes each week, and don't forget to tell your Waterloo colleagues and friends about us. Until next time, thanks for going Beyond the Bulletin with me.